They said a man born in chains could never wear a badge, that someone who grew up as property could never be trusted with the law. Yet, in the lawless territories of the Old West, one man would hunt down over 3,000 outlaws, becoming the most feared lawman the frontier had ever seen. The criminals thought it was a joke at first. Word spread through saloons and hideouts that a black deputy marshal was riding into Indian territory. A former slave, they whispered, as if that alone made him weak. They laughed over whiskey, betting on how long he'd last before running back to civilization. Some boasted they'd be the ones to put him in the ground. But those same outlaws would soon meet a man who moved through the wilderness like a ghost, who could track a killer across 100 miles of nothing, and who never, ever gave up. And by the time the dust settled, Bass Reeves would have a reputation that made hardened criminals surrender without firing a shot. Imagine yourself in 1875. The Civil War had ended a decade earlier, but the scars remained deep. Across the American frontier, chaos ruled. Indian Territory, what would later become Oklahoma, was a vast expanse of rough terrain where federal law barely existed. It was a refuge for the worst outlaws the nation had to offer. Murderers, horse thieves, bootleggers, and gangs who knew that crossing into the territory meant escaping the reach of most lawmen. The land stretched for thousands of square miles. Thick forests, rolling plains, river crossings that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. There were no roads, no towns in most places. Just scattered settlements and Native American nations trying to maintain their own sovereignty while criminals ran wild through their lands. For marshals, it was a death sentence of an assignment. Many refused to go. Those who did often didn't come back. The outlaws had every advantage. They knew the land, had networks of sympathizers, and could disappear into the wilderness for months. A lawman riding alone into that territory was prey. The statistics told a grim story. In the decade before Bass Reeves put on a badge, dozens of deputy marshals had been killed in Indian Territory. Shot from ambush, murdered in their sleep, or simply vanished into the wilderness, never to be found. Their families waited for news that never came. Their badges were returned to Fort Smith in sealed envelopes. So when Judge Isaac Parker took over the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, he faced an impossible task. His jurisdiction covered 74,000 square miles of the most dangerous land in America. To put that in perspective, it was larger than the entire state of Missouri. And within those 74,000 square miles, violence was the only law that mattered. He needed deputies who could survive out there. Men who were tough, resourceful, and absolutely fearless. Men who wouldn't fold under pressure or be bought off by the criminals they were supposed to catch. Judge Parker was a complex man. Stern, uncompromising, he would later become known as the hanging judge because of the number of men he sentenced to death. But he also had a sense of justice that was unusual for his time. He believed the law should apply equally to everyone, regardless of race. That belief would lead him to make one of the most controversial decisions of his tenure. That's when someone suggested Bass Reeves. The suggestion likely came from someone who knew Indian Territory well, someone who understood that conventional lawmen, no matter how brave, were failing. They needed someone different, someone who knew the territory as well as the outlaws did, someone who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted. And Judge Parker, despite the protests of those who said a former slave had no business wearing a badge, made a decision that would change the history of American law enforcement. The protests were loud and immediate. You can't give a badge to a colored man, some said. The outlaws will never respect him. Others were more direct in their racism. He'll either run at the first sign of trouble, or he'll abuse the power. The assumptions were thick, built on decades of prejudice that said black men were inferior, incapable of authority, unfit for responsibility. Judge Parker listened to the objections, then ignored them. He'd made his decision. Picture the man himself. Bass Reeves stood over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with eyes that seemed to see through lies. His hands were huge, capable of breaking a man's grip or handling a rifle with delicate precision. He moved with a quiet confidence that came from years of surviving in places where weakness meant death. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured. He never raised it unless necessary, and when he did, men listened. He was born into slavery in 1838 in Arkansas, the property of a man named George Reeves. His early years were spent in bondage, performing whatever labor his owner demanded. But even then, those who knew him noticed something different. He was sharp, observant, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. While other enslaved people kept their heads down, young Bass watched and learned. He studied the white men who claimed to own him, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their tells. He also learned skills that would serve him later. He became an expert horseman, able to handle even the most difficult mounts. He learned to shoot, initially to hunt game for his owner's table, but developing a skill that would become legendary. And he learned the most important survival skill of all: how to be underestimated, how to let people assume he was less intelligent, less capable, less observant than he really was. That skill would save his life more than once. During the Civil War, the story goes that Bass escaped slavery after a dispute with George Reeves, possibly over a card game. The details vary depending on who's telling the story. Some say George Reeves struck Bass during an argument, and Bass, finally pushed too far, knocked his owner to the ground. Others say Bass simply saw his opportunity when his owner left to join the Confederate Army. What's certain is that Bass fled into Indian Territory, knowing that crossing into tribal lands was his only chance at freedom. For years, he lived among the Creek and Seminole nations. This wasn't a simple matter of hiding in the woods. These were sovereign nations with their own laws, their own culture, their own way of life. Bass had to learn to navigate this world, to earn the trust of people who had every reason to be suspicious of a runaway slave. He did it by being useful, by being respectful, and by being someone they could rely on. He learned to track game across impossible terrain. The forests of Indian Territory were dense, the ground often hard or covered with leaves that revealed little to the untrained eye. But Bass learned to spot the broken twig, the disturbed leaf, the faint impression in the soil that told him an animal had passed. He could read the wilderness like others read books. He learned which plants were edible, which were poisonous, where to find water in drought, how to survive blizzards and heat waves. He became an expert marksman, deadly with both rifle and pistol, able to bring down game at distances that seemed impossible. And perhaps most importantly, he developed an understanding of Indian Territory that few white men could match. He learned the Creek language, then Seminole. He learned the Cherokee tongue. He could move between these nations, understanding their customs, showing respect in ways that white settlers often didn't. The tribal members came to trust him. They shared knowledge with him, teaching him the secret paths through the wilderness, the places where water could be found, the caves and hollows where a man could hide from pursuit. By the time the war ended and he was legally free, Bass Reeves had transformed himself into someone uniquely qualified for what was coming next. He'd spent years surviving in the very territory that now needed lawmen. He knew the land, he knew the people, and he'd developed a set of skills that made him perhaps the most qualified man in America for the job of Deputy Marshal in Indian Territory. But qualifications meant little in 1875 America. The color of his skin meant everything. When Judge Parker's deputy marshal arrived to recruit him in 1875, the meeting was tense. Bass Reeves was now 37 years old, settled with a wife and children. He'd built a life for himself as a farmer and rancher. He had every reason to say no to a job that would take him away from his family for months at a time, that would put his life in constant danger, that would pay relatively little. But something in the offer appealed to him. Maybe it was the chance to bring order to a place he'd seen consumed by chaos. Maybe it was the opportunity to prove something to a nation that had treated him as property. Maybe it was simply the knowledge that he could do the job better than anyone else. But when word spread that Judge Parker was considering appointing a black deputy marshal, the doubts were loud and public. Can he be trusted? Some asked. Will criminals respect a black lawman? Others were more blunt in their racism, insisting that giving a badge to a former slave was an insult to law enforcement itself. Some deputies threatened to quit if they had to work alongside a black man. Newspaper editorials questioned Judge Parker's judgment. Letters poured into Fort Smith protesting the decision. Bass Reeves didn't argue. He didn't make speeches about his qualifications or defend himself against the accusations. He didn't waste breath trying to change minds that were already made up. He simply said yes, took the badge, and rode out into the territory. His answer would come in the years that followed, delivered through action, not words. And that answer would be so powerful, so undeniable, that even his harshest critics would eventually fall silent. The badge itself was heavy, made of silver, with Deputy U.S. Marshal engraved around a star. When Bass Reeves pinned it to his chest for the first time, he understood what it represented. It wasn't just authority. It was responsibility. It was a trust that he couldn't afford to betray, because his failure would be used to justify prejudice against every black person in America. If he failed, they'd say, "See, we told you they couldn't do it." But if he succeeded, he might change history. The first time Bass Reeves rode into Indian Territory as a deputy marshal, he carried with him a simple philosophy. The law applies to everyone equally, or it applies to no one at all. It was a radical idea in 1875 America, where justice often depended on the color of your skin, your wealth, or your connections. But out there, alone in the wilderness with only his wits and his weapons, Bass Reeves would prove that the law was stronger than prejudice. His early assignments were tests. Judge Parker knew this, and likely so did Reeves himself. These weren't simple arrests. They were journeys into the heart of outlaw country, chasing men who would rather die than face the hangman's noose in Fort Smith. Each warrant meant days or weeks on the trail, sleeping under the stars, rationing food and water, always alert for ambush. The territory didn't care about your good intentions. It would kill you just as dead, whether you were a hero or a fool. Imagine riding through dense forest where every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. Your horse's hooves crunch through fallen leaves, and you know that sound carries for miles. The autumn wind rattles the branches overhead, and each gust might cover the sound of someone chambering around. You're tracking a man wanted for murder, someone who's killed before and won't hesitate to kill again. You're alone, days from any backup, and the only things keeping you alive are your skills and your nerve. The forest itself was an enemy. In summer, the heat was oppressive, the humidity so thick you could barely breathe. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, carrying malaria and yellow fever. In winter, temperatures plunged below zero, and a man could freeze to death if he couldn't find shelter. Spring brought floods that turned gentle creeks into raging torrents, and fall brought storms that could leave you lost and disoriented in minutes. Bass Reeves thrived in these conditions. Where other deputies traveled in groups for safety, Reeves often worked alone or with a single cook to help with the prisoners and camp duties. He developed methods that seemed almost magical to those who heard about them. His most famous technique was his use of disguises. In an era before photographs were common, when wanted posters carried only written descriptions, Reeves used this to his advantage. He could disguise himself as a drifter, wearing ragged clothes and affecting a limp. He could pose as a cowboy, complete with the swagger and the slang. He could even pretend to be an outlaw himself, spinning tales of crimes he'd supposedly committed, getting close to his targets before they realized who he was. His ability to shift his demeanor, his voice, even his posture was remarkable. One moment he was an authoritative lawman, the next a harmless vagrant. There are stories of him walking right into outlaw camps, sharing their fire and their food, only to reveal his badge when the moment was right. Can you imagine the audacity of that? Sitting across a campfire from men who'd kill you without hesitation if they knew who you were, laughing at their jokes, eating their food, all while planning exactly how you'd take them into custody. The nerves required for that kind of deception are almost incomprehensible. One of his early captures involved two notorious outlaws holed up in a cabin deep in Creek territory. They'd killed a storekeeper during a robbery and fled into the wilderness. Other deputies had tried to arrest them, but the outlaws had fortified the cabin and sworn they'd never be taken alive. They'd fired on anyone who approached, driving off 2 previous attempts. Reeves studied the situation carefully. He watched the cabin from a distance, noting when the outlaws emerged, what their routines were, how cautious they seemed. Then he came up with a plan that seemed insane. He waited until dark, then approached the cabin silently, moving through the forest without making a sound. But instead of trying to break in or call them out, he simply found a comfortable spot near their woodpile, sat down, and waited for morning. As dawn broke, the outlaws emerged from the cabin, stretching and yawning, probably planning their day. And there sat Bass Reeves on a stump, badge gleaming in the early light, rifle across his lap, as calm as if he were sitting on his own front porch. "Morning, gentlemen," he said in that deep, measured voice. "Beautiful day, isn't it? You're under arrest." The shock on their faces was such that they surrendered without reaching for their guns. Later, one of them said, "We were so surprised, we forgot we had weapons. And by the time we remembered, we realized that if we went for them, we'd be dead before we cleared leather." But not every arrest was so clean. The territory was unforgiving, and the men he hunted were desperate. There were shootouts in the darkness, bullets whizzing through the air, the muzzle flash of rifles lighting up the night. There were chases across swollen rivers, Reeves urging his horse into water that could easily sweep them both away. There were confrontations where a split second meant the difference between life and death, where the man who hesitated was the man who died. Reeves was quick with his weapons, impossibly accurate. Stories circulated about his marksmanship. They said he could shoot a man's hat off at 100 yards. They said he could hit a running target in the dark. Some of these stories were probably exaggerated, but the core was true. Bass Reeves was one of the finest shots on the frontier, but he never killed unless he had no choice. His job was to bring outlaws back alive to face trial. Judge Parker would handle the rest. Still, the skepticism followed him everywhere. When he returned to Fort Smith with prisoners, some lawmen muttered that he'd gotten lucky. Others claimed his arrests wouldn't hold up, that criminals would never respect the authority of a black deputy, that it was only a matter of time before he failed. But the prisoners themselves told a different story. They spoke of Reeves with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "He's not like other lawmen," one captured outlaw said. "He doesn't give up. Ever. And he knows the territory better than we do, which shouldn't be possible. But it is." The numbers began to speak louder than prejudice. While other deputies struggled to make a handful of arrests a year, Reeves consistently brought in multiple prisoners per trip. His warrant success rate was extraordinary. Other deputies might return empty-handed half the time, the warrants unserved because they couldn't find the suspect, or the situation was too dangerous. Reeves almost never came back without his man. Judge Parker took notice. More importantly, the outlaws took notice. In the saloons and hideouts of Indian Territory, Bass Reeves became a name spoken in hushed tones. At first there was mockery, jokes about the colored Marshal, who thought he could catch white men. But that mockery faded fast, replaced by wariness, then fear. Stories spread of his tracking abilities, of how he could follow a trail days old through rain and mud, of his disguises that fooled even cautious criminals, of his shooting skills that bordered on supernatural, of his absolute refusal to give up once he had your warrant. Men who had laughed at the idea of a black deputy marshal now told each other, "If Reeves is on your trail, you might as well turn yourself in. He'll get you eventually. Might as well save yourself the trouble of running." Some outlaws, hearing that Reeves had their warrant, left the territory entirely, preferring to take their chances elsewhere rather than face him. A few of the smarter ones simply surrendered to other deputies, knowing that at least then they'd be taken in without the weeks of being hunted through the wilderness. But reputation alone didn't make him safe. Every time he rode out, he faced the same dangers: ambush, exposure, starvation, and the constant threat of men who saw killing a lawman, especially a black lawman, as a badge of honor. There were outlaws who specifically wanted to be known as the man who killed Bass Reeves. They set traps for him, spread rumors about where they'd be to lure him into ambushes, and waited with rifles for him to appear. For Bass Reeves, Each sunrise meant another day of proving himself. Another chance to show that justice didn't care about the color of the hand that delivered it. He couldn't afford a mistake. One failure, one moment of weakness, and his critics would pounce. "See," they'd say, "we told you he couldn't handle it." The pressure was immense, constant, exhausting, but Reeves never let it show. The work was relentless, and the territory was vast, but Reeves had found his calling. He wasn't just catching criminals. He was rewriting what it meant to be a lawman in America. Every arrest was a statement. Every successful return to Fort Smith was proof. And slowly, grudgingly, the respect began to build. By the late 1870s, Bass Reeves had already made more arrests than most deputies would make in a lifetime. But it was his methods, his almost uncanny ability to outsmart the smartest outlaws, that began to set him apart. These weren't just criminals he was hunting. Many were experienced gunfighters, men who had survived years on the run by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the law. They'd killed lawmen before. They'd escaped from jails. They'd evaded pauses that numbered in the dozens. And yet, one man kept catching them. Picture the kind of men Reeves faced. There was Bob Dozier, a stone-cold killer who'd murdered multiple men and bragged he'd shoot any lawman who came for him. Dozier was smart, cautious, and had a network of friends who'd hide him, feed him, and warn him when marshals were near. He'd successfully evaded capture for 3 years. There were the Brunter brothers, a gang that terrorized Creek settlements, burning homes, stealing livestock, and killing anyone who resisted. They operated like a military unit, always armed, always watching. There was Greenleaf, a notorious outlaw who knew every hiding spot in the territory and had a reputation for vanishing into thin air when lawmen got close. These men didn't fear the law. They'd evaded capture for years, living free while less careful criminals swung from Judge Parker's gallows. But Bass Reeves had something they didn't expect: patience, strategy, and a willingness to become whatever he needed to be to get his man. He understood something fundamental about criminals. They expected lawmen to act a certain way, to approach openly, to demand surrender, to use force when necessary. Reeves did none of those things, predictably. One story stands out from this period, illustrating his methods perfectly. Reeves received a warrant for 2 outlaws hiding deep in the territory. They were staying with their mother in a remote cabin, and word was they'd shoot anyone who approached. Other deputies had tried and been driven off by rifle fire. One had been wounded. The outlaws felt safe. They knew lawmen would have to approach across open ground, giving them plenty of time to take aim. Reeves studied the problem for days. He talked to people who knew the area, learned about the family, understood the layout of the land. Then he made a decision that seemed insane. Instead of approaching as a lawman, he would approach as someone in need. He disguised himself as a vagrant, wearing tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. He dirtied his face, affected a limp as though injured, and even carried a broken walking stick. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. He approached the cabin alone, unarmed, or so it appeared. The weapons were hidden carefully under his ragged coat. He called out in a weak voice that he was lost and needed water. Inside the cabin, the outlaws and their mother heard him. They were suspicious, of course, but what they saw was a harmless, injured black man who looked like he could barely stand. Not a threat. The outlaw's mother came out first, cautious but sympathetic. Reeves played his part perfectly, thanking her profusely, his voice cracked and desperate. He asked about the nearest town, claimed he'd been robbed and left for dead. He spun a tale of woe that was just believable enough. She invited him to rest on the porch, brought him water, even offered him some food. Reeves sat there for hours, talking, charming her with stories, never once letting his guard down, but never showing a hint of his true purpose. He talked about his fictitious family, about the hard times, about trying to find work. He made himself sympathetic, harmless. When her sons finally emerged, curious about the stranger, they saw only a harmless drifter. They relaxed. That's when Reeves made his move. In one smooth motion, he revealed his weapons, his badge, and his purpose. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice suddenly firm and authoritative, "you're under arrest. You can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. But you're coming with me." The outlaws were so shocked, so completely caught off guard, that they surrendered without resistance. Later, one of them said, "I never saw it coming. One minute, he's a broke-down old man. The next, he's a deputy marshal with a gun in each hand. By the time my brain caught up with what was happening, I was already in handcuffs." Stories like this spread through the territory like wildfire. Bass Reeves wasn't just tough. He was smart, unpredictable. He thought like the outlaws he hunted, anticipated their moves, and always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. He understood human nature in a way that was almost eerie. He knew what people expected, what they feared, what would make them lower their guard, and he used that knowledge with devastating effectiveness. But intelligence and skill could only take him so far. The territory was enormous, and often his hunts lasted weeks or even months. Imagine the hardship. You're sleeping on the ground in freezing rain, your blankets soaked through, your body shivering uncontrollably. You're running low on food with days of travel still ahead, rationing your supplies, gnawing on hardtack that's more stone than bread. You're tracking a man across rivers swollen from storms, the current so strong that crossing means risking your life and your horses, and always, the knowledge that your target might be waiting in ambush around the next bend, rifle aimed at the trail, finger on the trigger. Reeves endured it all without complaint. He traveled with a cook, usually a trusted man who could help with the prisoners and camp duties, and sometimes another deputy to provide backup. But the tracking, the planning, the dangerous moments when confronting armed outlaws, those he handled himself. His cook later recalled trips where they covered hundreds of miles, arrested a dozen men, and Reeves never seemed to tire or lose focus. He'd get 3 hours of sleep and wake up ready to go, the cook said. "I've seen him track a man for 3 days straight without rest, without food, just water and determination." There were close calls that would have killed a less skilled or less lucky man. Once, while approaching a wanted man's hideout, Reeves was shot at from cover. The bullet tore through his hat, so close to his skull that he felt the heat of it passing. He dove from his horse, rolled behind a tree, and took cover. Then he waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then began to set. The outlaw probably thought he'd scared Reeves off, that the deputy had retreated to find help. But Bass Reeves didn't retreat. As darkness fell, Reeves moved. Silently, carefully, he circled around to where he estimated the shooter was hiding. The outlaw had stayed in position, rifle ready, watching the trail. He never saw Reeves coming from behind. The first he knew of it was when Reeves's voice cut through the darkness. "Drop the rifle. Slowly. You so much as twitch wrong, and you're dead." The outlaw froze, then carefully laid down his weapon. When asked later why he didn't try to fight, he said, "I knew if I moved, I was dead." That man moves like smoke. You don't see him, don't hear him, and then he's right behind you. Another time, Reeves tracked 3 outlaws for 2 weeks across brutal terrain. These weren't amateurs. They were experienced men who'd evaded lawmen before. They knew he was following them. The word had spread that Bass Reeves had their warrants, and they tried everything to lose him. They split up, forcing him to choose which trail to follow. They doubled back, trying to ambush him when he passed. They waded through streams to hide their trail, traveled across rocky ground that showed no tracks. Nothing worked. Reeves read every sign, anticipated every trick. When they split up, he examined the tracks carefully and chose to follow the freshest, knowing the others would eventually rejoin their leader. When they doubled back, he spotted the disturbed brush where they'd left the trail and avoided their ambush. When they tried to hide their trail in water, he found where they'd emerged by looking for disturbed moss on rocks, for mud stirred up in shallow pools. For 2 weeks, he stayed on them. The outlaws grew desperate. They were running low on supplies, exhausted from the constant movement, psychologically worn down by the knowledge that no matter what they did, he was still coming. Finally, He cornered them in a ravine with no other exit. They were trapped, out of options, too tired to fight effectively. "It's over," Reeves called out. "You boys have run as far as you're going to run. Come out peaceful, and nobody needs to get hurt." There was a long pause. Then, one by one, they emerged with their hands up. When he brought them back to Fort Smith, they were more exhausted than he was. One of them asked, "How? How did you stay on our trail?" "We did everything right." Reeves just smiled. "You boys left a path a blind man could follow. You just didn't know it." The respect was building, but so was the danger. Some outlaws decided the best defense was offense. If Bass Reeves was that dangerous, then he needed to be eliminated. There were organized attempts on his life, ambushes set up based on knowledge of his routes. Networks of informants tried to track his movements so they could set traps. But somehow, whether through instinct, careful observation, or just incredible luck, Reeves always sensed the trap. He'd change his route at the last moment, taking a different trail than expected. Or he'd approach from an unexpected direction, circling wide and coming in from an angle no one anticipated. And the ambushers would find themselves staring down his rifle instead of shooting him from cover. "It's like he can smell danger," one frustrated outlaw said. "You set up the perfect ambush, and he just doesn't show up where he's supposed to be." His reputation began to affect how criminals operated. Some fled the territory entirely when they heard Reeves had their warrant. They'd rather take their chances in Texas or Kansas than face him in Indian territory. Others tried to negotiate before he even arrived, sending messages through intermediaries offering to surrender to a different deputy. A few, the smart ones, simply turned themselves in to local marshals rather than wait for Bass Reeves to come hunting. Back at Fort Smith, Judge Parker relied on Reeves more and more. While other deputies complained about the difficulty of certain assignments, muttered about warrants being impossible to serve, Parker knew he could give those warrants to Reeves and expect results. The courtroom became familiar with the sight of Bass Reeves walking in with a string of prisoners, men who'd been considered uncatchable until Reeves went after them. The other deputies' attitudes began to shift. At first, many had been hostile, refusing to work with him, making their prejudice clear. But as the years passed and Reeves kept succeeding where they failed, kept surviving when others died, the hostility turned to grudging acceptance, then respect. They might not invite him for drinks, might not socialize with him off duty, but when they needed help with a particularly dangerous warrant, more than one deputy swallowed his pride and asked Bass Reeves for assistance. But the cost was mounting. Years of hard living in the wilderness took their toll. The constant danger wore on him, though he never showed it. He'd been shot at more times than he could count, had been grazed by bullets on several occasions, had taken a knife wound in one confrontation that left a scar across his ribs. His hands, once smooth, were now calloused and scarred. His face, weathered by sun and wind and cold, showed the years of exposure, and there was always the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of bad luck, could end everything. Still, Bass Reeves pressed on. Each arrest was a small victory against chaos. Each outlaw brought to justice was proof that the law could work, even in the most lawless places, even delivered by a man born into slavery. And each time he returned safely to Fort Smith, he defied the expectations of those who'd said a former slave had no business wearing a badge. The work was far from over. The territory still teemed with outlaws, and Reeves's reputation only made the most dangerous ones more determined to be the man who finally brought him down. But by the early 1880s, one thing was clear. Bass Reeves wasn't just a deputy marshal. He was becoming a legend. The outlaws had stopped laughing long ago. Now they just ran, and Bass Reeves kept catching them. By 1883, Bass Reeves was no longer just another deputy. He was the deputy outlaws feared most. His name carried weight. When word spread that Bass Reeves had your warrant, the smart criminals started planning their escape from the territory. The foolish ones prepared to fight, and the wise ones simply surrendered. But his greatest challenges still lay ahead. Cases that would test not only his skills as a tracker and lawman, but his character itself, his integrity, and his commitment to the principle that had guided him from the beginning. the law applies to everyone equally. The case that would define his career, that would cement his reputation, not just as a skilled lawman, but as a man of unshakable integrity, came in 1884. A warrant was issued for a man accused of murder in the territory. On the surface, it was routine. Murder warrants were common. Bass Reeves had served hundreds of them. But this one was different. This one carried a name that made his blood run cold. William Reeves, Bass Reeves' own son. The details of the crime were serious. William had gotten into an altercation with his wife. In the heat of anger, the situation had escalated to violence, and his wife had died from her injuries. There were witnesses. There was evidence. And now there was a warrant with his name on it. The news hit Fort Smith like a thunderbolt. Deputies gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating. How would Bass Reeves handle it? Would he recuse himself? Let another deputy make the arrest? Would he use his influence, his reputation, to protect his son? Would he suddenly discover that some warrants didn't need to be served with the same vigor as others? Some expected him to. Others hoped he would, understanding the impossible position he was in. What father wouldn't want to protect his son? What man could be expected to arrest his own flesh and blood, knowing he was sending him to face Judge Parker's harsh justice, possibly even the gallows? The pressure on Reeves must have been immense. His family surely pleaded with him. His wife, Nellie, facing the loss of her son, must have begged him to find another way. Judge Parker, to his credit, left the decision to Reeves himself. The old judge knew the man well enough by now to trust his judgment. He also knew that whatever Reeves decided would have consequences far beyond one case. If Reeves recused himself, his critics would say he couldn't be trusted when it mattered. If he arrested his son, he would prove once and for all that his commitment to equal justice wasn't just words. Bass Reeves didn't hesitate. He took the warrant, his hand steady as he read his son's name. His voice was firm when he spoke. "The law is the law," he said simply. "It doesn't matter whose name is on the warrant. It has to be served." And he rode out to find his son. Imagine that ride. The weight of the badge suddenly heavier than it had ever been. Every mile bringing him closer to a confrontation no father should face. He'd arrested over 1,000 men by this point. He'd faced down killers, gunfighters, and desperados. But this was different. This wasn't some outlaw he could track without emotion. This was his son, his boy, someone he'd held as an infant, taught to ride, hoped would build a good life. The internal struggle must have been agonizing. Every instinct of fatherhood pulling him one direction. Every principle he'd built his career on, pulling him another. He could have turned back. He could have claimed he couldn't find William. He could have let another deputy handle it. No one would have blamed him. Most would have understood. But Bass Reeves had spent nearly a decade proving that he was different, that his word meant something, that justice in his hands was truly blind. He found William Reeves and brought him in. The arrest was clean, professional. Whatever words passed between them remained private, locked behind the iron will of a man doing his duty. Did he embrace his son one last time? Did he speak words of comfort or condemnation? Did William plead with him, rage at him, or accept his fate with understanding? We don't know. What we know is that Bass Reeves returned to Fort Smith with his son in custody, ready to face trial. The courtroom was packed when William Reeves stood before Judge Parker. People had come from across the territory to witness this moment. Would Bass Reeves testify against his own son? Would he stand by his principles even now? The answer came when Reeves took the witness stand. His voice was steady, his testimony factual. He recounted what he knew of the case, presented the evidence he'd gathered, and answered every question put to him. In that courtroom, he was a deputy first and a father second. William faced trial, was convicted, and served his sentence. The process was agonizing for the entire Reeves family. Nellie Reeves had to watch her husband send their son to prison. The other children had to grapple with their father's choice, and Bass Reeves himself carried a burden that few could understand. He'd upheld the law, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The story spread across the territory and beyond. Even hardened outlaws were stunned. "He arrested his own son," they said to each other in disbelief. Bass Reeves arrested his own son. The statement carried weight because it destroyed any remaining argument that Reeves played favorites, that he could be swayed by personal considerations, that his justice was anything less than absolute. If Reeves would arrest his own flesh and blood, then no one was above the law. Not friends, not family, not anyone. The arrest did something extraordinary. It ended any remaining doubt about his integrity. Critics who'd spent years looking for evidence that Reeves was corrupt, that he abused his authority, that he wasn't fit to wear a badge, suddenly had nothing to say. What could they claim? That a man who'd arrest his own son couldn't be trusted? The argument was absurd on its face. Even those who hated what Bass Reeves represented, who despised the idea of a black lawman, had to acknowledge that he possessed a level of integrity rare in any man, regardless of color. But the personal cost was immense. The pain of that choice haunted him, though he never spoke of it publicly. Those close to him saw the toll it took. Friends later recalled that Bass Reeves aged visibly in the months after Williams' conviction. The lines in his face deepened. The light in his eyes dimmed slightly. He still did his job with the same skill and determination, but there was a weight on him that hadn't been there before. Yet he never wavered in his belief that he'd done the right thing. When asked years later if he regretted the decision, he simply said, "I did what the law required. That's all." Other cases during this period pushed him to his limits in different ways, testing his courage, his skill, and his determination. There was the time he received a warrant for an outlaw named Jim Webb, a quick-draw artist who'd killed several men in gunfights. Webb had a reputation across the territory as one of the fastest guns alive. He'd bragged openly that he'd never be taken alive, especially not by a black lawman. He'd said he'd rather die than let Bass Reeves put him in chains. The confrontation came at a creek crossing in Cherokee territory. Reeves had been tracking Webb for 3 days, following a trail that led deeper into the wilderness. He knew Webb was dangerous, knew the man wouldn't surrender peacefully. But the warrant had to be served. That was the job. When Reeves finally caught up with Webb, the outlaw was watering his horse at the creek, unaware that he'd been found. Reeves called out from cover, his rifle aimed at Webb's back. "Jim Webb, you're under arrest. Don't reach for your weapon." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Webb's hand was near his pistol. He had to make a choice: surrender or fight. And in that split second, Webb made the wrong choice. His hand moved toward his gun. Both men fired almost simultaneously. The crack of gunfire echoed across the creek. Webb's shot went wide, kicked off by his quick draw that sacrificed accuracy for speed. Reeves's bullet struck Webb in the chest, the impact spinning him around before he fell into the shallow water of the creek. Reeves approached cautiously, rifle still aimed, but it was over. Webb was dead before he hit the ground. It was one of the rare times Reeves had to kill a man he was trying to arrest, and it weighed on him. He'd given Webb every chance to surrender. He'd called out, identified himself, given clear instructions. But Webb had chosen violence, and Reeves had responded with the skill that had kept him alive for years. When he brought Webb's body back to Fort Smith, he filed a detailed report explaining exactly what had happened. Judge Parker reviewed it and cleared Reeves of any wrongdoing. It was a clean shoot, justified under the circumstances, but Reeves took no pride in it. He'd wanted to bring Webb in alive, to let the law decide his fate. Violence was always the last resort. Then there was the pursuit of the Brunter brothers, a case that would test Reeves's patience and determination like few others. The Brunter gang had terrorized the territory for years. 5 brothers, all skilled with weapons, all willing to kill without hesitation. They'd murdered, robbed, and burned their way across Creek and Seminole lands. They were smart, well-armed, and had successfully evaded every lawman sent after them. Multiple posses had tried to capture them. All had failed. Judge Parker gave their warrants to Bass Reeves. "I need these men brought in," Parker said. "They're making a mockery of the law. If anyone can get them, It's you. Reeves studied the case carefully. He talked to witnesses, examined crime scenes, built a profile of how the brothers operated. They moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a few days. They had a network of supporters who provided them with supplies and warnings, and they'd proven willing to fight any lawman who got too close. Reeves tracked them for months. Not continuously, but persistently. Whenever he got a lead, he followed it. Whenever someone reported seeing the gang, he investigated. Slowly, patiently, he pieced together their patterns, their habits, their hiding places. He learned that they favored certain areas, that they tended to return to familiar territory after their raids, and he began to predict where they'd go next. The final confrontation came when Reeves located their hideout in a fortified position with clear sightlines in every direction. The brothers had chosen well. Any assault would be suicide. They'd see attackers coming from hundreds of yards away and cut them down with rifle fire. It was why previous posses had failed. They'd tried direct approaches and been driven off with casualties, but Bass Reeves didn't try a direct approach. Instead, he watched. For 3 days, he observed their movements from concealment, noting when they emerged from their hideout, what their routines were, when they seemed most relaxed. He saw that they posted guards, but that those guards grew less vigilant at night, tired after long days of watching. And he noticed that in the hours just before dawn, when exhaustion was at its peak, the camp was at its most vulnerable. On the 4th night, Reeves made his move. He approached silently through the darkness, moving with infinite patience. Each step was carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. It took him hours to cover the distance that could be walked in minutes. But speed wasn't the goal. Silence was. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Bass Reeves was in position. He waited until full light, until the brothers were stirring, emerging from their shelter. Then he revealed himself, rifle ready, positioned so they couldn't all draw on him at once. "Federal Marshal," his voice rang out. "You boys are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." It was a bluff. He wasn't surrounded, but the brothers didn't know that, and the shock of finding a lawman inside their perimeter, when they'd been certain they were safe, broke their will to fight. One by one, they dropped their weapons. By noon, all 5 Brunter brothers were in chains, captured without a shot fired. When Reeves brought them back to Fort Smith, the story spread like wildfire. The Brunter gang, uncatchable for years, taken by one man through patience and strategy. The brothers themselves seemed almost dazed by what had happened. When asked how Reeves did it, one of them shook his head. "We had the perfect setup. No one should have been able to get close to us, but he did it anyway. That man's not human." Stories like this became part of the Bass Reeves legend. His methods became textbook for law enforcement, though he never wrote them down. He worked from instinct, experience, and an almost preternatural understanding of human nature. He could look at a crime scene and reconstruct what happened, seeing details others missed. He could interrogate a witness and know immediately if they were lying, reading their body language, their tone, the small tells that betrayed deception. And he could track a fugitive across terrain that left other deputies baffled, following signs so subtle they seemed like magic. There was also his famous shooting ability. Stories circulated across the territory of Reeves, hitting targets at incredible distances, of shooting guns out of outlaws' hands without killing them, of never missing when it mattered. Some of these stories were exaggerated over the years, growing in the telling as legends do, but the core truth remained. Bass Reeves was one of the finest marksmen on the frontier. One story that was verified by multiple witnesses involved a shooting demonstration at Fort Smith. Some deputies, skeptical of the stories they'd heard, challenged Reeves to prove his skill. They set up tin cans at progressively longer distances, 50 yards, then 100, then 200. Reeves methodically knocked them all down, barely seeming to aim. Finally, someone placed a can at 300 yards, a distance at which most men couldn't even see a target clearly. Reeves took his time, judged the wind, adjusted his stance, and fired. The can flew into the air. The watching deputies fell silent. There was nothing more to say. But perhaps his greatest weapon was something simpler than shooting skill or tracking ability: his word. When Bass Reeves gave his word, it was iron. He never broke a promise, never went back on an agreement. If he promised safe passage to someone who helped him, that person was protected, even if it complicated his case. If he said he'd bring a man in alive, he did everything in his power to make it so. And if he told an outlaw there was no escape, it was the truth. This reputation for absolute honesty had practical benefits. Informants trusted him, knowing he'd keep his word about protecting their identities. Witnesses cooperated, believing he'd follow through on his promises. And sometimes outlaws surrendered to him rather than other deputies, because they knew Reeves would treat them fairly, would get them to Fort Smith alive, and would testify truthfully about their cooperation if they provided it. By the mid-1880s, his arrest count had climbed past 1,000. 1,000 outlaws brought to justice by one man. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Other deputies in Indian Territory might make 50 or 100 arrests in their entire careers, and they'd be considered successful. Reeves had already eclipsed them tenfold, and he was nowhere near finished. He was in his late 40s now, an age when most lawmen were thinking about retirement, but he showed no signs of slowing down. The respect he commanded transcended race in ways that were extraordinary for that era. White outlaws, who'd grown up in a society that told them they were superior to black men, found themselves outwitted, outfought, and arrested by Bass Reeves. The cognitive dissonance must have been intense. How could a black man, supposedly inferior, consistently outsmart and outperform them? Some went to their executions still grappling with that question, their worldview shattered by the reality of Bass Reeves. One condemned killer, standing on the gallows at Fort Smith, was asked if he had any final words. He looked out at the crowd and said, "I want everyone to know, Bass Reeves is the finest lawman I ever encountered. He was fair, he was honest, and he was better at this job than any 10 white men. Color didn't matter when you were up against Bass Reeves. Only skill mattered, and he had more of that than any man I've known." Coming from a white criminal about to hang in an era of intense racism, the statement was remarkable. Native Americans in the territory also respected him deeply. He spoke several tribal languages fluently: Creek, Seminole, Cherokee. He understood their customs and treated them with dignity at a time when most white lawmen did not. He didn't see them as savages to be subdued, but as people with their own laws, their own sovereignty, their own right to respect. Many tribal members provided him with information and assistance, knowing that Reeves, unlike other deputies, would honor his agreements and treat them fairly. When he gave his word to a Creek chief or a Seminole elder, they knew it was good. This relationship with the tribes gave him a significant advantage. He could move through tribal lands more easily than other deputies, could get cooperation where others met hostility, could gather information that was denied to lawmen who treated Native Americans with contempt. It was another example of Reeves's fundamental understanding that respect and honor were more powerful than force and intimidation. But the work never got easier. If anything, it got harder as the years passed. By the late 1880s, the outlaws who remained were the smartest, the most careful, the most dangerous. The careless ones had been caught or killed years ago. What was left were criminals who'd learned from the mistakes of others, who knew Bass Reeves's methods and tried to counter them, who understood that staying free required constant vigilance and careful planning. It became a chess game played across thousands of miles, with lives hanging in the balance. Reeves would track a man for weeks, get close, only to have the outlaw slip away at the last moment, warned by informants or simply lucky. He'd have to start over, following new leads, building new strategies. It was frustrating, exhausting work. But Reeves never gave up. That was his defining characteristic: absolute persistence. And still, Reeves kept riding out, kept serving warrants, kept bringing in outlaws. Each warrant was another chance to prove that justice wasn't just for the powerful, wasn't just for those who could afford expensive lawyers or had influential friends. Each arrest was another statement that the law could work, even in the most lawless places, even delivered by a man born into slavery, even against men who thought they were untouchable. The legend continued to grow, spreading beyond Indian territory. Newspapers in Kansas City, St. Louis, even Chicago began carrying stories about the remarkable black deputy marshal who'd arrested over 1,000 criminals. Some of these stories were sensationalized, turning Reeves into a larger-than-life figure. But those who knew him understood that the reality was impressive enough without embellishment. Bass Reeves didn't need exaggeration. His actual accomplishments spoke for themselves. The Outlaws had stopped laughing long ago. The mockery that had greeted his appointment in 1875 seemed like ancient history now. Now they just ran when they heard his name, and Bass Reeves kept catching them, one warrant at a time, one arrest at a time, building a record that would stand unmatched in the history of American law enforcement. The work took its toll, but he never complained, never quit, never compromised his principles. He had a job to do, and he'd do it until he couldn't anymore. By 1890, Bass Reeves had become something few lawmen ever achieve, a symbol. His name meant something in Indian territory and far beyond. It meant that justice was coming, inevitable as the sunrise, unstoppable as the seasons. But the cost of that reputation was measured in something few people saw: the toll on the man himself. Imagine 2 decades of riding through hostile territory, 2 decades of sleeping with one eye open, of eating cold food because a fire might give away your position, of tracking dangerous men through country that killed the careless without mercy. 2 decades of knowing that every time you rode out might be the last time, that somewhere in those vast forests or endless plains, a bullet with your name on it might be waiting. Reeves was now in his 50s, an age when most men were settling into easier lives, thinking about grandchildren and rocking chairs. He kept riding. The physical toll was obvious to anyone who looked closely. His hands, once smooth, were now a roadmap of scars. Rope burns from wrestling prisoners into restraints. Knife scars from close quarters, fights. The permanent calluses from 2 decades of holding reins and triggers. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined deeper than his years should warrant. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of a bullet wound that had nearly killed him. His hearing in one ear was diminished from too many gunshots fired without protection. But the invisible toll was perhaps greater. The mental weight of constant vigilance, of never being able to fully relax, of always scanning for threats. The emotional burden of the violence he'd witnessed, and sometimes had to deliver. The memories of men he'd killed in self-defense, their faces haunting his dreams. The knowledge that families had been destroyed by his arrests, children left fatherless, wives left widowed. He'd done his duty, upheld the law, but the human cost was real, and it weighed on him. The stories from this period reveal a man at the peak of his abilities, but also deeply aware of his own mortality. On one pursuit, tracking a murderer through the Creek Nation during winter, Reeves and his posse were caught in a blizzard. The temperature plunged below zero. The wind howled with such fury that visibility dropped to a few feet. Snow piled up so fast that their horses struggled to move. Reeves's companions wanted to turn back, to find shelter and wait out the storm. They'd freeze to death if they kept going, they argued. Reeves refused. "The Outlaw's not waiting for good weather," he said. "Neither are we." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. They continued, pushing through drifts that came up to the horses' chests. The cold was so intense that their breath froze in their beards. Their fingers went numb even in gloves. Their faces burned with frostbite. But Reeves kept moving forward, following a trail that should have been impossible to see. 3 days later, when they found their man half frozen in an abandoned cabin, the Outlaw's first words were, "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't stop." There was no anger in his voice, just a kind of exhausted resignation. He'd done everything he could think of to escape. He'd traveled through weather that should have made pursuit impossible. And still, Bass Reeves had found him. The outlaw surrendered without resistance. What was the point of fighting? If Reeves could track him through a blizzard, there was nowhere he could hide. That relentless determination became his trademark. But it came at a cost that few understood. There were injuries over the years that never fully healed, bullet wounds that ached in cold weather, broken bones from falls that left lasting pain, exposure to extreme weather that left damage to his lungs. Reeves bore these scars quietly, never using them as excuses, never complaining. When asked once about the limp he'd developed after being shot in the leg during an ambush, he dismissed it with a shrug. Still gets me where I need to go. The personal sacrifices were immense and ongoing. His family saw him rarely. Nellie Reeves, his wife, spent more time apart from her husband than with him. Months would pass between visits home. Sometimes he'd return for a few days, just long enough to see that everyone was all right, and then he'd be gone again, off on another manhunt. His children grew up with a father who was more legend than presence, someone they'd heard stories about but rarely saw. Many lawmen's wives became widows. It was an occupational hazard so common that it barely made the newspapers anymore. Another deputy killed in Indian Territory. Another family left behind. Nellie Reeves lived with that possibility every single day. Every time Bass rode out, she had to face the reality that he might not come back, that the next knock on her door might be someone bringing news of his death. Yet she supported his work, understanding that it meant something larger than one family's comfort or happiness. He was doing something important, something that mattered, but the cost of that importance was measured in lonely nights and constant worry. As the 1890s progressed, Indian Territory itself began to change. The wild, lawless character of the place was slowly being tamed. Railroads pushed through, bringing with them towns and civilization. What had been wilderness was becoming settled. The outlaw havens were shrinking. The endless forests where criminals could disappear for months were being cut back, turned into farmland. Progress was coming, and with it, a different kind of order. This was due in part to men like Bass Reeves, who'd made it clear that crime had consequences. The outlaws who'd once roamed freely were dead, imprisoned, or driven out. The ones who remained were more cautious, less brazen. They knew that even in the remotest corners of the territory, the law could reach them. A new generation of criminals operated differently, trying to blend in rather than openly defying authority. But Reeves kept working. The job wasn't done. Criminals still needed to be caught. Warrants still needed to be served. And as long as Judge Parker needed him, Bass Reeves would ride. By 1900, his arrest count had climbed past 3,000. 3,000 arrests. The number is almost incomprehensible when you really think about it. To put it in perspective, that's an average of more than 100 arrests per year for 3 decades. That's 2 arrests every week for 30 years straight. And these weren't simple drunk and disorderly cases that could be wrapped up in an afternoon. These were murderers who had to be tracked across hundreds of miles. Horse thieves who knew every trick for covering their trail. Bootleggers with elaborate operations and networks of supporters. Violent criminals who required weeks of careful investigation and dangerous confrontations. Each arrest represented days or weeks of hard work, of danger, of skill. The total represents a career so remarkable that it strains belief. To understand the magnitude, consider that the entire Fort Smith Marshal Service, with dozens of deputies working the territory, averaged around 200 arrests per year total. Bass Reeves, working alone or with one partner, was personally responsible for more than half that number in many years. He wasn't just good at his job, he was operating at a level that others couldn't match. The new century brought new challenges and uncertainties. Oklahoma was moving towards statehood, and with that came changes in law enforcement. The jurisdiction of Judge Parker's court was shrinking as the territory was carved up and reorganized. The old system of federal marshals in Indian Territory, the system under which Reeves had operated for over 2 decades, was being phased out. For the first time in his adult life, Bass Reeves faced uncertainty about his future. Would there be a place for him in the new order? Or would statehood mean the end of his career? Judge Isaac Parker, who had been Reeves's patron and supporter for so long, died in 1896. His death was a blow to Reeves, personally and professionally. Parker had believed in him when few others did, had given him the chance to prove himself, had stood by him through controversies and criticism. The judge who replaced Parker didn't have the same relationship with Reeves, didn't understand his methods, or appreciate his record in the same way. In 1907, Oklahoma finally became a state. Indian Territory ceased to exist as a separate entity, incorporated into the new state. The old system of federal marshals was dissolved completely. Bass Reeves, now nearly 70 years old, could have retired. God knows he'd earned it 1,000 times over. He could have spent his remaining years with Nellie, with his children and grandchildren, resting after 3 decades of the hardest, most dangerous work imaginable. Instead, he took a job with the Muskogee Police Department, becoming one of the first black police officers in the new state of Oklahoma. Even in his late 60s, he wasn't ready to stop. The work was different from what he'd been doing. City police work lacked the high drama of his days hunting outlaws through the wilderness. There were no more month-long tracking expeditions, no more sleeping under the stars, no more confrontations with desperate criminals in remote cabins. Now it was walking a beat, enforcing city ordinances, dealing with drunks and thieves and domestic disputes. But Reeves brought the same discipline and integrity to the work. He patrolled his assigned district with the same attention to detail he'd brought to tracking outlaws. He enforced the laws fairly, treating everyone with equal dignity regardless of their race or station. And he became a respected, even beloved figure in Muskogee. People who met him on the street, not knowing his history, saw only an elderly black policeman doing his job. But those who knew his story, who understood what he'd accomplished, saw a living legend walking among them. Children in particular seemed drawn to him. He'd stop to talk with them on his rounds, asking about their school, their families. He'd tell them stories, carefully edited versions of his adventures, emphasizing the importance of honesty and hard work. Do the right thing even when it's hard, he'd tell them, especially when it's hard. That's when it matters most. For the black children of Muskogee, Bass Reeves was proof that they could aspire to something greater, that the color of their skin didn't have to limit what they could achieve. He worked for the Muskogee Police until 1909, when age and illness finally forced him to stop. He was 71 years old and had given nearly 35 years to law enforcement, a career unmatched in its scope and impact. When he turned in his badge for the last time, it marked the end of an era. The Wild West was truly over. The frontier was closed, and Bass Reeves, the greatest lawman that Frontier had produced, was finally retiring. His final year was difficult. His health, compromised by decades of exposure and hard living, deteriorated rapidly. He developed Bright's disease, a kidney condition that was often fatal in that era. The man who'd been so strong, so seemingly indestructible, was confined to his home, growing weaker each day. Nellie cared for him, and his children visited when they could. He faced his approaching death with the same calm dignity he'd brought to everything else in his life. Bass Reeves died on January 12, 1910, at the age of 71. The news spread quickly through Muskogee and beyond. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Lawmen came from across Oklahoma and neighboring states to pay their respects. Judges attended. Ordinary citizens, both black and white, came to honor a man who'd made their world safer. The service was held at a local church, and the crowd was so large that many had to stand outside, unable to fit in the building. The newspapers, which in his early years had barely acknowledged his work or had covered it with thinly veiled racism, now ran extensive obituaries recognizing him as one of the greatest lawmen in American history. The Muskogee Times-Democrat wrote, "In the history of the early days of eastern Oklahoma, the name of Bass Reeves has a place in the front rank among those who cleansed out the old Indian territory of outlaws and desperados. No story of the conflict of government's officers with outlaws can be complete without mention of Bass Reeves." Another paper noted, "He was a man of great courage and was in many gun battles with outlaws. He was never shot, and while he arrested over 3,000 men and women, he was never charged with the misuse of his authority." That last point was significant. In an era when law enforcement corruption was common, when many lawmen used their badges as licenses to steal and intimidate, Bass Reeves had maintained absolute integrity. Not once in 32 years was he credibly accused of abusing his authority, taking bribes, or acting unjustly. But for years afterward, his story began to fade from public memory. In the decades following his death, as racial segregation tightened across America, as Jim Crow laws made black citizens into second-class inhabitants of their own country, the story of a black deputy marshal who'd outshone his white peers became inconvenient. It didn't fit the narrative that those in power wanted to tell. History books ignored him. The legends of the Old West that were published and celebrated focused on other names, usually white men like Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok, whose accomplishments, while notable, paled in comparison to Reeves. The erasure was systematic and thorough. Books about frontier lawmen mentioned dozens of deputies, but somehow overlooked the one who'd made more arrests than all the others combined. Museums displayed artifacts from famous marshals, but had nothing from Bass Reeves. Movies and television shows about the Old West featured countless white lawmen, but never the black deputy, who'd been the most effective of them all. For generations, American children learned about Billy the Kid and Jesse James, but Bass Reeves' name was unknown to them. It would take decades, nearly a century, before historians began to recover his story, to recognize what he'd accomplished, and restore him to his rightful place in American history. The work of rediscovery began slowly in the 1960s and 70s, as African American historians sought to uncover the forgotten stories of black achievement. They found Bass Reeves in old court records, in dusty newspaper archives, in the fading memories of elderly residents who remembered the stories their grandparents had told them. Gradually, the truth emerged. This wasn't a minor figure or an interesting footnote. This was arguably the greatest lawman of the frontier era, perhaps of any era. His arrest record stands unmatched and likely unmatchable. His integrity was absolute. His skill was legendary even among those who'd witnessed it firsthand. And his impact on American law enforcement, on the very concept of equal justice, reverberates still. Today, we know the truth. Bass Reeves wasn't just a good deputy marshal who happened to be black. He was the standard by which all other lawmen should be measured. His career demonstrates what's possible when skill, determination, and integrity combine. His life proves that excellence transcends the arbitrary categories society tries to impose. And his legacy challenges us to examine our own assumptions about who gets to be a hero, whose stories deserve to be told, and what real justice looks like. The moral of Bass Reeves' story cuts to the heart of what justice means and what character requires. When he was born in 1838, the law declared him property, something to be bought and sold like livestock. When he put on a badge in 1875, many said he wasn't qualified to enforce that same law. They said a former slave couldn't be trusted with authority, couldn't command respect, couldn't uphold the very system that had once enslaved him. But Bass Reeves understood something profound, something that his critics couldn't grasp. The law isn't about who wears the badge. It's about whether that badge is worn with honor. Every time he rode into Indian territory, he carried more than warrants and weapons. He carried proof that prejudice lies, that a man's worth isn't determined by his birth or the color of his skin, but by his actions and his character. The outlaws who'd laughed at the idea of a black lawman learned that lesson the hard way, usually from inside a jail cell or while being marched back to Fort Smith in chains. The white deputies who'd refused to work with him eventually came asking for his help. The critics who'd said he'd fail eventually fell silent, their arguments demolished by 3,000 arrests and 30 years of exemplary service. His story teaches us about persistence and the power of simply refusing to quit. 3,000 arrests didn't happen because Bass Reeves was lucky, or because he had some advantage others lacked. They happened because he never gave up. When a trail went cold, he found it again. When outlaws thought they'd escaped, he proved them wrong. When others said something was impossible, that a man couldn't be tracked through a blizzard, or that an outlaw was too smart to be caught, Reeves did it anyway. Persistence, more than any other quality, defined his success. It teaches us about integrity and the cost of maintaining it. Arresting his own son would have broken many men, or at least bent their principles. It would have been understandable, even forgivable, if Reeves had found a way to avoid that duty, if he'd let another deputy handle it, if he'd used his influence to protect his boy. No one could have blamed him. But Reeves stayed true to what he believed. The law applied to everyone equally, even when enforcing that principle tore his heart apart. That kind of integrity is rare in any era, in any field. It's the kind of integrity that can't be faked or compromised, that either exists in someone's core or doesn't exist at all. And it teaches us about the quiet dignity of simply doing your job well, without seeking glory or recognition. Bass Reeves didn't write memoirs bragging about his exploits. He didn't seek fame or try to profit from his reputation. He didn't make speeches about equality or justice or the rights of Black Americans. He just kept riding out, kept bringing in outlaws, kept proving through action that he belonged. In the end, his record spoke louder than any words could have. The numbers, the documented arrests, the testimony of those who'd worked with him told a story that couldn't be denied or argued away. There's something deeply moving about his life when you really contemplate it. A man born into slavery who became the embodiment of justice. A man dismissed and doubted at every turn who became the most feared and respected lawman on the frontier. A man who could have become bitter about the prejudice he faced, who could have used his authority to settle scores or prove points, but instead channeled everything into excellence and fairness. He could have been angry. God knows he had reason to be. But instead he was just relentlessly, undeniably excellent at his job. Think about what that means for us today. We all face doubt from others or from within ourselves. We all encounter people who underestimate us based on surface judgments, who assume they know our capabilities without ever seeing what we can do. We all hit obstacles that seem insurmountable, challenges that appear designed to make us fail. Bass Reeves shows us the answer isn't in arguing or complaining or demanding that others change their minds. It's in the work itself. Do it so well that doubt becomes irrelevant. Prove it through consistency and integrity until respect becomes inevitable. When the outlaws stopped laughing, when the skeptics went quiet, when even those who hated what he represented had to acknowledge his greatness, Bass Reeves had won something more valuable than fame or wealth. He'd won truth. The truth that character matters more than circumstances. That justice is colorblind when practiced by the just. That one person, armed with principle and determination, can change how the world sees what's possible. His legacy lives on in ways both visible and invisible. In the obvious sense, it lives in the history books that are finally being corrected and expanded to include his story, in the museums that now display artifacts from his career, in the statues and memorials that have been erected in his honor in Oklahoma. In 2013, Bass Reeves was inducted into the Texas Trail of Fame. There are schools named after him now, buildings that bear his name. The U.S. Marshal Service has honored him as part of their history, recognizing him as one of the greatest deputy marshals ever to serve. But his legacy lives on in deeper, more important ways too. It lives in every lawman who takes the oath seriously, who understands that the badge isn't a license for power, but a responsibility for service. It lives in every officer who treats all citizens with equal dignity, regardless of their race, wealth, or status. It lives in every person who believes that justice should be blind to everything except the facts, that the law should apply equally to everyone, from the richest to the poorest, from the most powerful to the most vulnerable. His story has inspired countless people who faced their own barriers, their own doubters, their own mountains that seemed impossible to climb. Civil rights activists pointed to Bass Reeves as proof that Black Americans had always contributed to building this nation, had always been capable of excellence in any field they were allowed to enter. When people said that Black officers couldn't be trusted with authority, historians could point to Bass Reeves and ask, then how do you explain 3,000 arrests over 30 years without a single credible accusation of corruption? His life also serves as a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about American society. How many other Bass Reeves were there? How many talented, capable Black Americans were denied opportunities because of the color of their skin? how much poorer is our history because their stories were never recorded or were deliberately erased? Bass Reeves succeeded despite enormous obstacles, but how much more could he have achieved without those obstacles? And how many others, equally talented but perhaps less fortunate, never got the chance to show what they could do? The erasure of his story for so many decades is itself a lesson. It shows how history gets written by those in power, how narratives get shaped to serve certain interests, how inconvenient truths get buried. The story of Bass Reeves was inconvenient to those who wanted to maintain racial hierarchy, who needed to believe that white men were inherently superior. So his story was allowed to fade, deliberately forgotten, left out of the official histories. The fact that we're only now, more than a century after his death, truly recognizing his accomplishments is a testament to how deeply prejudice can distort our understanding of the past. But there's hope in the recovery of his story too. It shows that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, that excellence, real excellence, can't be hidden forever, that the work of historians and truth seekers can recover what was lost and restore what was taken. Bass Reeves' story was nearly lost, but it wasn't. It survived in fragments, in old records, in fading memories, in the persistent work of those who knew it mattered. And now it's being told again, passed on to new generations who need to hear it. Think about the specific lessons his life offers us. First, there's the lesson about preparation. Bass Reeves didn't become the greatest lawman on the frontier by accident. He spent years learning the skills he'd need, years living in Indian territory, learning the languages, understanding the land, years practicing with his weapons until his marksmanship became legendary, years developing the patience and strategic thinking that would make him so effective. When his opportunity came, he was ready. Not lucky. Ready. Second, there's the lesson about integrity as a strategic advantage. Reeves' absolute honesty wasn't just a moral choice, though it certainly was that. It was also a tactical advantage, because he always kept his word. Informants trusted him, because he treated everyone fairly. Witnesses cooperated with him, because he never broke promises. Even outlaws knew they could trust certain things he said. His integrity made him more effective at his job, not despite being the right thing to do, but because it was the right thing to do. Third, there's the lesson about the power of consistency. Reeves wasn't just good occasionally, or in certain situations. He was excellent all the time, in every case, for 3 decades. That consistency is what built his reputation, what made him legendary. Anyone can have a good day or pull off one impressive feat. Reeves did it again, and again, and again, until even his harshest critics had to acknowledge his skill. Consistency over time is more powerful than any single achievement. Fourth, there's the lesson about choosing your battles. Reeves could have spent his energy fighting against the prejudice he faced, arguing with every person who doubted him, demanding respect before earning it. Instead, he focused on the work. He let his actions speak for him. He didn't waste time on arguments he couldn't win through words when he could win them through deeds. That doesn't mean prejudice should be ignored, or that people shouldn't fight against it. But it does mean there's wisdom in knowing when to engage directly, and when to simply prove people wrong through excellence. Fifth, there's the profound lesson about duty and sacrifice. Bass Reeves could have had an easier life. After escaping slavery and the Civil War ended, he could have focused solely on his family, his farm, his own comfort. Taking the badge meant choosing a path of constant danger, long separations from loved ones, and enormous personal cost. He chose it anyway, because he believed the work mattered, because he saw that Indian territory needed law and order, because he understood that his success could open doors for others. He paid a price for that choice, but he never seemed to regret it. Finally, there's the lesson about redemption and transformation. Bass Reeves was born as property in a system that declared him less than human. The society that enslaved him said he was incapable of responsibility, intelligence, authority. But he took that same system's laws and used them as a force for justice. He became an agent of the very government that had once allowed his enslavement. Some might see that as ironic or even tragic, but perhaps it's better understood as transformative. He helped transform what the law could mean, who could enforce it, and how it could be applied fairly. His story challenges us to ask difficult questions. When we look at our own society today, who are we underestimating? What talented people are we overlooking because they don't fit our preconceptions? What Bass Reeves of our generation is being denied opportunities because of prejudice, whether based on race, gender, class, or some other arbitrary category? And what are we losing as a society when we let prejudice limit human potential? The story also reminds us that change is possible, but often slow and hard-won. Bass Reeves didn't end racism by becoming a great lawman. Black Americans continued to face discrimination long after his death, continued to be denied basic rights, continued to be treated as second-class citizens. His individual excellence, as remarkable as it was, couldn't single-handedly transform society. But it did crack the foundation of prejudice. It did prove something important. It did inspire others. And it did leave a legacy that we can build on. There's something almost mythic about his life when you step back and look at the arc of it. Born into slavery in 1838, escaped to freedom during the Civil War, lived with Native American tribes, learning their ways, became a deputy marshal at 37, spent 3 decades hunting outlaws across Indian territory, made over 3,000 arrests, never charged with corruption or abuse of authority, lived to see Oklahoma become a state, died in 1910, having witnessed the transformation of the Wild West from lawless frontier to settled civilization. It's the kind of story that Hollywood would invent if it weren't already true. And perhaps that's part of why his story was forgotten for so long. It almost seemed too good to be true. A former slave who became the greatest lawman of his era, who arrested his own son to uphold the law, who disguised himself to infiltrate outlaw gangs, who tracked criminals through blizzards and across hundreds of miles, who never lost a gunfight when he had to draw his weapon. It sounds like fiction, but it's not. It's documented history, verified through court records, newspaper accounts, and the testimony of hundreds of people who knew him or encountered him. The fact that it sounds like fiction but isn't, that reality in this case is more impressive than any invented story could be, makes it all the more important that we remember and tell his story. Because it shows what's possible. Because it provides a model of integrity and excellence that transcends time and circumstance. Because every generation needs heroes who exemplify the best of what humans can be. So what can we take from the life of Bass Reeves as we face our own challenges today? Perhaps this: when the world doubts you, when prejudice tries to define your limits, when people say you can't do something because of where you came from, or what you look like, or what arbitrary category you've been placed in, remember the man who was born a slave and became a legend. Don't waste breath on arguments with those who've already made up their minds. Don't wait for permission or approval from people who've decided you don't deserve it. Don't let their limitations become your limitations. Just do the work. Do it with integrity. Do it so well that history has no choice but to remember. Do it with such consistency and excellence that even your critics eventually have to acknowledge the truth. Bass Reeves proved that the content of your character outweighs the circumstances of your birth. That dedication defeats doubt. That persistence overcomes prejudice. That one person with unshakable principles can bring order to chaos and justice to places where it seemed impossible. That excellence is the most powerful argument, and that a life lived with integrity and purpose echoes long after death. The Outlaws stopped laughing more than a century ago. The skeptics who said he'd fail are long dead, their predictions proven embarrassingly wrong. The system that enslaved him has been destroyed, though its legacy persists in ways we're still grappling with. But Bass Reeves' legacy continues to grow. His arrest record still stands unmatched. His example still inspires. His story still teaches. And his proof, delivered through 30 years of unwavering service, still echoes. Justice has no color. Excellence knows no boundaries. Character transcends circumstance. If this story moved you, if the legend of Bass Reeves reminded you that greatness comes from perseverance, integrity, and refusing to be defined by others' prejudices, then share it. Talk about it. Make sure his name isn't forgotten again. Tell it to young people who need to know that barriers can be overcome, that excellence is the answer to doubt, that one person really can make a difference. Make sure the children growing up today, especially those who face their own doubters and barriers, know about the man who was born into slavery and became the greatest lawman of his era. And if you want to hear more stories of people who changed history despite everything stacked against them, people who proved that courage, integrity, and determination can overcome any obstacle, make sure to subscribe. The past is full of heroes who deserve to be remembered, whose stories got buried by prejudice or simply lost to time. Heroes like Bass Reeves, who showed us what's possible when character meets opportunity, when skill is given a chance to prove itself, when justice is truly blind to everything except the truth. Bass Reeves rode his last trail in 1909. He died in 1910. But his legend rides on, carried forward by everyone who believes that doing the right thing matters, that integrity is non-negotiable, that justice should be equal, and that excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice. The badge he wore is in a museum now, but the principles he lived by, the standard he set, the proof he provided, those are eternal. They're his true legacy, and they belong to all of us.